Now we're going to talk about why and how disasters get media coverage. Some disasters get no coverage at all. Maybe they're small, maybe there were no fatalities, maybe they took place away from media outlets. Some things are more likely to get covered than others because so many emergencies and disasters occur every single week. The media must choose the most important ones to cover. There's only so much space in the newspaper, the website, or the broadcast. Media agents can influence the selection of a disaster, sometimes independent of the disaster's characteristics, with a few exceptions. So think about the disasters you have seen in the media. Which ones do you see most often? Which ones do you think get the most media attention? Here's a striking image of a forest fire in Gun Lake near Gold Bridge, British Columbia from August 2023. How does this image make you feel? Here's an image of houses almost completely underwater during flooding in Abbotsford, BC in November 2021. And here's an underwater striking image of a volcano located in the deep sea off the coast of Vancouver Island in 2026. These images all have something in common. They all have a high likelihood of getting coverage because they are unexpected and they are intense. Slower disasters like droughts or famines that happen over months or years can be deadly and harmful, but they don't happen overnight usually. So the question on a media editor's mind is, why would I cover this today if something believed to be more urgent is happening right now? And the data supports this. So which disasters actually garner the most news attention? This chart shows the proportion of each type of disaster that receives news coverage. The top ones are earthquakes, volcanoes, storms, fires, and floods. These are all sudden onset disasters that strike fast and are hard to predict. And they are also visually dramatic if you think about the images of the forest fires and lava flows or city streets covered with water that we just saw. These images and the sudden nature of the event elicit strong interest and emotions from viewers, us. And the media is, of course, a business. So what are people going to buy? What are people going to click on? That is what gets the coverage. Because of this selectivity, the less spectacular, but oftentimes more deadly natural disasters tend to get passed over. Food shortages, for example, result in the most casualties and affect the most people per incident. But as I mentioned, their onset is more gradual than that of a volcanic explosion or a sudden earthquake. As a result, food shortages are covered only 3% of the time, while a comparatively indulgent 30% of earthquakes and volcanic events get their time in the spotlight. Additionally, when the researchers who made this figure held all else equal by controlling for factors such as yearly trends in news intensity and the number of people killed and affected, the difference in coverage is even more pronounced. This bias for the spectacular is not only unfair and misleading, but also has the potential to misallocate attention and aid. This is problematic because disasters that happen in an instant leave little time for preventative intervention. On the other hand, the gradual disasters that tend to affect more lives build up slowly, allowing for more time for preventative measures to be taken. But it's in this catch-22 situation, it's the gradual nature of these calamities that is also what prevents them from garnering the media attention and prevention they deserve. Slower disasters tend to get coverage when something dramatic happens, like a celebrity visits, or the UN writes a report with striking statistics, or there's a human interest story. I should also mention, you might have been wondering why epidemic is only 2%, and that's because this data is from 1968 to 2002. And so I would say that this epidemic statistic is no longer accurate as it doesn't include crises like SARS and COVID-19. So we know the likelihood of coverage increases if the disaster is unexpected and intense. or is perceived as dramatic. Now, it also increases if the disaster causes high mortality, which makes sense because it is an indication of the severity or scope of the event. But the relationship between high mortality rates and high levels of news coverage is not always straightforward or consistent. How many deaths does it take for a natural disaster to be seen as newsworthy? This is a question researchers Eisensee and Stromberg asked in a 2007 study. These two authors found that for every person killed by a volcano, nearly 40,000 people would have to die of a food shortage to get the same probability of coverage in U.S. televised news. In other words, the type of disaster matters to how newsworthy networks find it to be. This visualization shows us what's called a casualties ratio. It tells us, all else equal, how many casualties would make media coverage equally likely for each type of disaster. So while an earthquake only requires 2 casualties to get media coverage, a drought requires 2,300 casualties to get news coverage. But the type of disaster is not the only factor that interacts with news coverage by mortality. Region also complicates this equation. For example, the Congo War that took place in the 1990s was, quote, for much of the world invisible, unquote, despite 4 million people being killed. In one classic global study of news coverage and mortality rates, Adams found that reporting the death of 1 Westerner was equivalent to the loss of 3 Eastern Europeans, 9 Latin Americans, 11 Middle Easterners, and 12 Asians. Mortality rates alone, he argues, are not a sufficient guide as to why a disaster receives media attention. In 2006, CARMA International found that only 1% of victims of the 2004 Boxing Day Indian Ocean tsunami came from the global north. Yet, 40% of media attention focused on that 1% of victims. Such news reporting, quote, ultimately reproduces an exclusively Western sensibility towards Westerners' own suffering at the expense of sufferings of distant others, unquote.